I was thinking about on New Year's Eve, we were out with some very close friends, and we always ask the question, what was the highlight and the low light of the past year as we think about the next year? And I thought, in ways, maybe my favorite moment of last year was both beautiful and painful. And once a year, I take a group of donors, or potential donors, to one of our programs around the world. And I always take one of my children along, because it's a chance. I travel a lot, and it's a chance to really share the experience. And this was the first time I've taken my youngest daughter, Lily, and we went to Cambodia, which was so a big stretch. Habitat has a great program there. And we were building alongside a woman named Soy Lorng, and by material standards, when Jesus talked about the least of these, she had had a really tough time. She and her husband contracted HIV/AIDS. Her husband died. Even before they died, they were living on a garbage dump in a one-room shack that flooded with sewage on a regular basis, with no access to fresh water, no sanitation. And then when he died, they couldn't afford the rent even on their little shack, and they were squatting in a tough area of Phnom Penh, just with a tarp over their meager possessions. And the night before we dedicated her home, it had just rained torrentially. This was summertime, towards the late part of the rainy season. And she had spent the whole night, she told me, standing up, just trying to keep the tarp from ripping apart and keeping their meager possessions and her mom and 2 children somewhat dry. And we dedicated the house, and then a big storm rolled in. And so she invited us all into her new home. Very simple, one-room block home, and we all rushed inside. We had just put the wooden shutters on the windows, and the rain is just pelting down. And I watched her and her daughter as they were both looking around the ceiling, and they were just watching to see if any water was going to come in their new house. And it was, I'm very happy to say, completely dry in spite of my poor construction ability. And this smile just broke out on their faces as we talk about a home, and it's something so many of us just take for granted, but we also talk about building hope. And suddenly, for her children, this was going to be one of those inflection points. Now, for the first time, they're going to be able to go to school. They were going to be able to stay healthy. They had access to proper sanitation, fresh water, and instead of just thinking about survival, they could think about a future. And those are the good days. Those are the days that just lift the spirits, and where you just have such a sense of God's presence. And those are the days that can keep me running fast. I was blessed with an incredible role model. My parents we grew up in fairly modest circumstances in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. My dad was a teacher. My mom stayed home with our large family. My grandmother was a remarkable iconoclastic woman. Some of you may remember her. Her name was Millicent Fenwick, and she was one of the first women in Congress from New Jersey. And she had the unusual distinction of having, earlier in her life, written the Vogue Book of Etiquette, which was a million bestseller in 1947, and then later becoming a ferocious champion for human and civil rights. And so it was pretty scary at her house, because to graduate to the grown-up table, you had to be able to sit up straight and hold your fork properly and discuss food problems in sub-Saharan Africa, which was, both fascinating and terrifying as a 10-year-old. And she fully expected that you would have read the New York Times before you came to the table. And almost every time I saw her, she did not waste a lot of energy on niceties, but she would drill into each of us and say, she would usually quote Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. So act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. Pretty good marching orders. And then she'd ask us what we were going to do to be useful, because her general view is we should all be useful. And it took me a lot. It's really become my life verse over time, but it took a long time to live into that. And I fast forward a little bit, I was a English poli-sci major in college, and I thought I was going to go into politics. I was going to go to law school and go into politics, and I suddenly came to the realization I had no interest in being a lawyer. I just thought that's what you did so you could go into politics. So I thought, I've got to come up with something else to do, and it's a long story I won't tell, but I ended up talking my way into a job at Goldman Sachs that I was completely unprepared for, and with the logic that I would somehow learn finance and accounting faster than they could teach other people to communicate, so it would all work out. And then I suffered mightily for that hubris, but it was an incredible education, and worked in New York for a couple of years. And it was a very rich time from a stretching and learning perspective. I worked ludicrously hard, but I had a deepening sense when I would look in the mirror that I just wasn't living the life that sort of lined up with what I had imagined living. And I thought before, I'd gotten interested in business at that point, but I thought before I do more of this, I need to go out and get resettled. And I applied for a bunch of different things and was lucky enough to win a grant from the Henry Luce Foundation. And Luce was the founder of Time magazine, and he had, his parents had been missionaries in China, so he had a deep interest in Asia. And every year the foundation sends 15 Americans under the age of 30 from all different walks, careers, off to live in Asia for a year and work, not an academic scholarship. And I was fascinated with sports, and Korea was about to host the Olympics. And so I volunteered for anything at Goldman Sachs that was related to Korea, and Goldman happened to be sponsoring the second ever Korean convertible bond offering for a Korean company. So I went over to Seoul, and they didn't know I was a junior slave, and said, hey, I can work for free, and lined up a job with the Olympic Organizing Committee doing marketing work, which I was so excited about. Then to my great surprise, they said, well, we see all this rowing in your background. I'd been a competitive rower. We just fired our coach. We only qualify because we're the host country. Would you coach our rowing team? And I said, well, no, I'm not qualified. You don't. And they were like, no, we were serious. And so I quit Goldman early and went to the U.S. Rowing Coaching College. And some of my old coaches were not very threatened by the Koreans, so they were incredibly generous. And I ended up spending the next year in the Korean training camp with all the Korean coaches and athletes and a Russian boxing coach. And it was just life-changing in so many ways. There's no question it has made life more joyful and meaningful ever since. And I came out of that process thinking I wanted to do something meaningful still, but I wanted to do it maybe through the business world. And Stanford was one of the early schools that believed that the nonprofit and public sectors needed professional management, which is now a more mainstream idea, but was less so then. And so I ended up going back to business school, getting an MBA, but with a certificate focus in public and nonprofit management. And then got convinced there that I should go learn skills in the private sector, and then I could take them eventually into the public or nonprofit sector. And so it was and then the process was much more surprising than I ever expected. And I went, my now wife of 25 years, but then girlfriend, was practicing law in Washington, D.C., and we had been very long distance in different directions, from Korea to California to Georgia. So I promised to try to get a job in Washington, and ended up with the Marriott Corporation, which was a great experience, great company. Got to work on a couple of their new businesses that are still, and then got laid off, which was an unexpected surprise. This was the S&L crisis, for those of you who remember our cycles, and Marriott nearly went bankrupt, which is less known. And I had not expected that. I'd just been promoted. I thought life was good. And my entire team got laid off, which the whole strategic planning group, which I thought was concerning. And And I was happy to find actually was still employable, and ended up, in some ways, in a dream job with the Walt Disney Company, helping work on new theme parks and resorts, and worked on two great startups that have been very successful, and one spectacular failure, which is another story I don't have time to tell. But Disney, there was the pixie dust. We were in Orlando, and it was just, Mickey and how great is life. And then there's the movie studio and kind of the tougher side of Disney as well. And I remember thinking about, if I'm really going to have a career, maybe we should go out to California and pay our dues in Burbank. And my wife hated that idea. And there was a senior manager who's no longer with Disney, great company, but I still remember he had two quotes he was just famous for. And I'm trying to be salt and light out in the business world. His two quotes were, well, if you don't come in Saturday, don't bother coming in Sunday. Think about that. So not so family friendly. And then. And his other one was, well, other companies do good cop, bad cop. We do bad cop, antichrist. So I thought, wow. And I remember actually apologizing to potential partners for the fact that we were going to be completely unreasonable, but I hope we could still find a way to work together. And Disney was sort of on top of the world back then, and I think life has not always been so smooth. And it is a fabulous company, but I thought, that is going to be tough. And I was just wrestling with that. We were about to have our first child, and one of those calls come out of the blue. And that kept happening in my life, at least. And I don't believe in coincidences. But right then, it was a call from Circuit City Stores. And now the next two companies I work for don't exist anymore. So all my credibility as a business person is now erased. But back then, if you can remember, which Brad can attest, Circuit City was actually doing really well. They were a hot company. They'd been the best performing stock in the New York Stock Exchange for a decade. And they had just come up with this idea for CarMax. And I just thought that was fascinating. And a friend of mine from Marriott was going to go run CarMax. And they wanted me to take his place. And I just thought that was such an interesting thing. And the idea was start the next CarMax. And so we moved to Richmond and took CarMax public. And I'll speed up. Everything was going great, and then Wayne Huizenga wanted to buy CarMax, wouldn't sell it, so he came up with a clone, AutoNation, and opened them all in all the same places we had CarMax locations, and that stalled what had been fast growth. Best Buy did something it's unheard of in retail, which is instead of dying when they nearly crashed, they reinvented themselves and came back incredibly strongly with a new format and new stores. And they were suddenly grabbing big chunks of market share. And then we'd started this other business that was kind of my boss's kind of pet. And it was amazing technology, but we never were able to get all the movie studios. And it was a precursor to video on demand, but we could never get all the retailers and all the movie studios together. And I think lots of flaws, but that wasn't going very well. And so we had teed up a new business that I was going to start. And I had to go to the board and say, that would be a terrible mistake. We just can't we can't fight 3 full-out battles and start something else, and we need to actually focus on the core. And I was discouraged. I was ready to be in an operating role, and almost to that day, got a call again out of the blue with a question of, do you want to go to Minneapolis? And it was a chance to run, be head of the operations and president of a retail chain called Musicland, and that was back then actually the largest retailer of music and movies in malls back when kids actually, there was a day when kids bought music on plastic discs, if you can imagine such a thing. And I told my wife, gosh, I got the most surprising call today. And she said, Minneapolis. Now she gets cold if it's below 65 degrees or 70 degrees. She said, God would not want me to go to Minneapolis. This can't be from God. So she was quite convinced. And but we prayed about it, and it just seemed like what we were supposed to do. And we ended up in Minneapolis, and it was actually an incredibly rich time. We found one of the aphorisms I like is, if you're not sure what to do, look for where God is at work and go join him there. Pastor named Henry Blackaby said that, and we found this incredible church, a Presbyterian church that we were not looking for at all, and got very involved there. I'd had an avocation all this time of helping coach pastors. I got very interested in church leadership, and I thought seminaries were doing a terrible job of coaching pastors on the how do you manage a church side, and so had done a lot of work to support pastors in church leadership. And speeding up, unexpectedly, Best Buy bought Musicland, which we were not looking for. It was great for shareholders, did not turn out to be a great thing in some other ways, but we couldn't do it. And I stayed for a year to try to work with the new team. They wisely put in a new person from Best Buy to run it, which made perfect sense, but it was a little awkward because suddenly it didn't really make sense for both of us long term to be there. And we had the big conversation about 11 months in, and it was clear I needed to think about a different thing. They were kind enough to say there might be additional future businesses or other things for Best Buy. But Ashley and I prayed about it and thought, well, maybe now's that time to make the leap. And it seems so clear, actually. And so I never counsel people, go take another job if you don't, or don't leave your job till you have the next thing lined up, because it's tougher. But this seemed so clear. So I went in and said, you know what, we've really thought about it, and we think now's the time. I want to make the change. So I left, and I had a great plan. I was going to take about a year off and be with my kids, and I was going to had all this list of things I wanted to do, and we could go service, and then I was going to have this perfect job at the end of that year in the nonprofit world, and I thought, this is all great. And the one thing that was very special, another of those inflection points, is that with my wife's blessing, I went on a mission trip to India. And I always struggled to take the time, and I didn't want to take time away with family, but in this case I had lots of time for the family, so she blessed it. And I went off and served just for a couple of weeks in Uttar Pradesh in central India and serve with a group known as the Bungi. And in India, the Dalits, pejoratively called the untouchables, are at the bottom of the caste system in India. And the Bungi are at the bottom of the caste system. So literally, these are families that are only allowed to hand clean latrines and clean up dead animals. And they're not allowed to live in the same communities with everyone else. They live outside the walls. And even today, about half of the children in these families die before the age of 13 because of the conditions they live in. And it just shattered me. And all those sort of latent social justice feelings just kind of bubbled back up. And to see both the horrific conditions that God's children were living in was so upsetting. And then also what a relatively small, group of people could do to make a difference. I'm going to do something about it. You get off the couch and out in the community and decide you're going to be a part of making a difference. And I came back from that trip not knowing what I was going to do, but pretty well convinced that I wanted to spend the rest of my time doing something to alleviate poverty. We felt, but we really felt that this is what we were supposed to do. And it's such a God thing, I think, because the last headhunter I talked to right after I'd made that decision called up with a chance to run an internet retail chain. It was an incredible job. And I was like, oh, that's a great job. I'm going to go work for my local church. And I thought, I will never hear from you again. And interestingly, 2 years later, when I was not looking at all, very happily working in the church, and she called back and said, Jonathan, do you know anybody who'd be interested in Habitat for Humanity, which is executive search code speak for, are you interested? And I remember it was just the adrenaline just kind of shot down my back, and I just got quiet for a minute. And I said, does it have to be somebody famous? And I went home and wrote this 2-page letter about why I didn't know if that was exactly the right thing, but I knew that was the kind of thing I felt God had been preparing for me all my life. And then didn't hear anything for quite a while, and then suddenly things accelerated extremely fast, and a few months later, I ended up with the opportunity to serve with Habitat. And I look back, and all those pieces that didn't make sense, every step along the way has been extremely valuable in terms of our highly complex ministry. And that time of seasoning and learning in the church was just exactly the complement I needed to be, I think, spiritually and personally prepared.